Yeah, it's interesting because what we're talking about here does have different contractual and legal considerations, partly depending on where you are. But the kind of co-employment type laws between the UK and the US, for example, there's some broad similarities. My take on it is that the contingent workforce space is quite highly regulated, and it's quite clear, as clear as these not very clear government assessment systems make it. It's pretty clear what you should be doing in terms of regulating the SOW space. It kind of doesn't need regulating in itself because it's a business to business interaction a company's being paid to deliver a service. They either do what's contracted or they don't do what's contracted. That's as far as it goes. But the regulations that apply to the contingent workforce laws are relevant in that space where people are blurring the lines. So what we see a lot of the time is companies getting quite nervous if there's a lack of differentiation between what they're classing as statement of work and what they're classing as staff augmentation. I mean, we talked about you talked about ultimately, if you can't measure hours, you got nothing. What have you got? Well, I would put forward the assertion that in services procurement, you're going to be measuring different things, and it comes down to that word outcomes, which is something where it's a totally different thing. If you're engaging workers, individuals under a certain period of days, hours, whatever it might be, that's kind of on the never potentially in terms of how long it's going to take. But you've got people at a certain level doing work, and that's what people are used to a lot of the time. I've got people working on it. They're doing their best. We're moving along. How long is it going to take? Kind of don't really know. It's harder to tie that down. But you know what you're paying per hour per day, and you can feel comfortable with that. With an outcome, as you said, sometimes people might look at it and go, outsourcing it is a higher overall cost. But I would question that. That's not necessarily going to be the fact all of the time, in the sense that the supplier is taking the risk for delivery. And if it's contracted effectively with clear outcomes set out, they're either going to deliver them or they're not. And actually, in terms of how expensive that's going to end up being against contracting is up for debate. Plus, you don't have that delivery risk if it ends up taking longer or if something goes wrong. So the things that typically would get measured in services procurement are different. They're more like, if I look at my supply base, how many projects have they run? What's their average win ratio? What's their average cost overrun? At a milestone level on every project they've worked on, how often are they on time, on budget? How often does the scope change? You can make some really interesting analysis around that, but it's different criteria. So I think that's like ideal world textbook statement of work services procurement.
Right.
However, we do have this, and if you look at it if you think about it from a kind of MSP contingent workforce point of view, what's the entry point going to be? It's not going to be going from contingent workforce straight into the most sophisticated services procurement. It's going to be contingent workforce into whatever's adjacent to it as far as statement of work goes. So, but when you were talking earlier, you were saying about potentially this skew more towards fixed bids and more outcome based. What do you think are the drivers that are pushing in that direction?
It's interesting, and this is something you and I talked about down in Dallas, is that one of my projects, I said, hey, listen, well, this will probably take me this many hours, and I can be done by this date, and it'll cost this much, right? And they can kind of back into, well, what's Chris's hourly rate for this? And like, okay, great. I was asked actually to remove the number of hours that it would take me. And again, I'm giving you data. I'm intentionally giving you this, and you're intentionally saying, I don't want the data. Again, that's a governance decision that they're making to say, all right, what do we not want to know because it might raise questions? And I think that's a curious, odd thing, but I understand it because the regulation that is around that. They'd rather put the rug over some pieces of information just to avoid anything that could be perceived as non-compliance. But ultimately, what was, if you're a vendor there, you say, okay, well, then it's actually going to cost you more. Like you could increase it, and then they don't kind of raise an eyebrow at it. So uh, it is curious to me, and the whole scenario that you just walked through about, well, how is that vendor performing? How long does it take? How many days are they past their milestone date that was agreed to in the contract? that's assuming that you're capturing all that information within the contract, but within the VMS. And that's where you can structure that kind of a workflow to, hey, and measure a little bit more equitably and equally, consistently. Um, but overall, that's not happening. I would say 7 times out of 10, if I can be generous. And sometimes that might be intentionally, as I just kind of painted the picture there.